April 1945. The Third Reich is crumbling, Berlin is falling, and across Nazi Germany, a different kind of justice is about to begin. While history remembers the trials and executions of Nazi leaders, there's another story that's been largely forgotten: the fate of their wives. These women who lived in stolen mansions, wore looted jewelry, and built their luxury on the bones of genocide. What happened to them when the reckoning came? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about justice, complicity, and how some of history's most privileged accomplices managed to escape the consequences of their choices. Picture this. It's May 2nd, 1945, just days after Hitler's suicide. In a small Italian town called Bolzano, American soldiers surround a modest boarding house. Inside, a woman clutches her teenage daughter's hand as boots thunder up the stairs. This is Margarete Himmler, wife of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust. The woman who once hosted tea parties while slave laborers tended her gardens is now just another refugee, but not for long. Within hours, she and her daughter Gudrun would begin a journey through Allied prison camps that would last 2 years and shape the rest of their lives. But Margarete wasn't alone. Across the ruins of the Reich, the wives of Nazi leaders were facing their own day of judgment. Emmy Göring, who had lived like royalty in a castle filled with stolen art. Lina Heydrich, widow of the man who planned the final solution, who had personally beaten prisoners of war on her estate. These weren't just bystanders, they were active participants in a system of murder and theft on an unprecedented scale. Here's what's shocking. While their husbands faced execution or life imprisonment, most of these women would walk free within a few years. Some even got their pensions back. How is that possible? The answer lies in one of the most complex and controversial chapters of post-war justice, a story of legal loopholes, social attitudes, and the uncomfortable question of where complicity ends and guilt begins. Let's go back to the beginning. Throughout the war, these women hadn't just enjoyed Nazi privilege, they had actively maintained it. Take Lina Heydrich. After her husband Reinhard was assassinated in Prague in WW2, she didn't retreat into quiet widowhood. According to testimony from the Czech war crimes tribunals, she coercively kept a number of prisoners of war working on her estates as forced laborers, and she physically abused them, beating them if they did not do what she wanted. This wasn't passive complicity, this was hands-on cruelty. Emmy Göring lived in Karrenhall, a massive estate north of Berlin that was essentially a museum of stolen European art. She hosted lavish parties while millions starved in ghettos and concentration camps. Her wardrobe alone, filled with furs and jewelry looted from Jewish families, was worth millions in today's money. But as the Allies closed in during early 1945, their world of luxury began to collapse. Margarete Himmler later described those final months to Allied interrogators. "We fled in the night with only what we could carry. Everything we had built was gone in hours." She and 15-year-old Gudrun had escaped their villa just ahead of advancing Soviet forces, joining the millions of German refugees streaming west. The capture scenes were often dramatic. When American troops finally cornered Margarete and Gudrun in that Italian boarding house, the teenager reportedly screamed at the soldiers, "You don't understand! My father was a great man!" This wasn't just adolescent defiance, it was the beginning of a lifelong crusade that would make Gudrun Himmler one of the most notorious Nazi apologists in post-war Germany. The interrogations that followed were intense. Allied intelligence officers had a critical mission: to uncover hidden Nazi assets, locate war criminals still in hiding, and determine how much these women actually knew about their husbands' crimes. The sessions often lasted hours, with officers pressing for details about bank accounts, hidden valuables, and the whereabouts of other Nazi officials. Here's where the story gets complicated. Most of these women claimed ignorance. They insisted they knew nothing about the Holocaust, nothing about their husbands' specific crimes, nothing about the source of their wealth. Some of these claims were obviously false. How do you live in a house filled with stolen art and claim you don't know where it came from? But proving what they knew in a court of law was nearly impossible. The legal framework the Allies used was called denazification, a systematic attempt to purge German society of Nazi influence. Every adult German was categorized into one of 5 groups: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, or exonerated persons. The problem was that this system was designed primarily for men who held official positions in the Nazi party or government. What do you do with women who wielded no official power but lived luxuriously off Nazi crimes? The results were inconsistent, to put it mildly. Margarete Himmler was classified as a follower, the second lowest category. She lost her pension, her voting rights, and was ordered to perform manual labor cleaning rubble from bombed buildings. But she served no prison time for war crimes. After 2 years in internment camps, she was released to live quietly in Munich, where she worked as a seamstress until her death in 1967. Lina Heydrich's case was even more controversial. Czech authorities, who had witnessed her abuse of prisoners firsthand, tried her in absentia and sentenced her to life imprisonment. But she was in Allied custody in Germany, and German denazification courts reached a different conclusion. They classified her as merely a follower and eventually cleared her entirely. Not only did she avoid prison, but she successfully sued to get her late husband's SS pension restored. She used the money to open a restaurant on Fehmarn Island, in the same building where she and Reinhard Heydrich had once lived. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had personally beaten prisoners of war, whose husband had organized the Wannsee Conference that planned the systematic murder of European Jewry, was not only free, but receiving a government pension based on her husband's SS service. She eventually remarried a Finnish theater director and lived comfortably until her death in 1985. Emmy Göring faced property confiscation and social ostracism, but she too avoided serious punishment. She spent time in various internment camps and prisons, but was released in 1998. She spent her remaining years fighting legal battles to recover art and property with mixed success. But here's what's truly disturbing. Many of these women showed no remorse. Gudrun Himmler, who had experienced the Allied prison camps as a teenager, spent the rest of her life defending her father's legacy. She became a central figure in Stille Hilfe, an organization that secretly provided support to former SS members and fugitive war criminals. When she died in 2018 at age 88, she had never once acknowledged her father's role in the Holocaust. The contrast with their husbands' fates couldn't be starker. Hermann Göring committed suicide hours before his scheduled execution. Heinrich Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule during his first Allied interrogation. Reinhard Heydrich had been assassinated during the war. These men faced the ultimate consequence for their crimes. Their wives, who had lived off the proceeds of those same crimes, largely returned to normal lives. This wasn't accidental. It reflected the social attitudes of the 1940s, when women were often viewed as politically passive, incapable of independent moral agency. As historian Claudia Kuhns wrote, "Far from being impressionable or innocent, women made possible state murder in the name of interests that they defined as maternal." But the legal systems of the time struggled to address this reality. There were also practical considerations. The Allies were dealing with millions of displaced persons, a devastated economy, and the emerging Cold War. Resources for denazification were limited, and there was growing pressure to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark against communism. Pursuing lengthy legal proceedings against Nazi wives wasn't a priority. The human cost of this approach becomes clear when you consider the survivors. Imagine being a Holocaust survivor, seeing your family's property in a Nazi official's home, and then watching that official's wife successfully recover her pension in court. Imagine being a former prisoner of war who was beaten by Lina Heydrich, only to learn that she was running a restaurant with money from the German government. Yet the story isn't entirely one-sided. Some of these women did face genuine hardship. They lost their social circles, their financial security, and their place in German society. They lived under suspicion and often hostility from their neighbors. Their children faced discrimination and struggled with their family legacy. This doesn't excuse their complicity, but it complicates the narrative of easy forgiveness. Perhaps the most tragic legacy is how some of these women used their freedom. Instead of acknowledging the horror their families had enabled, they became guardians of Nazi memory. They raised children who grew up believing their fathers were heroes. They maintained networks that helped war criminals escape justice, providing money, false papers, and safe houses to men who should have faced trial. The story of the Nazi wives reveals an uncomfortable truth about how justice works. Legal systems struggle to address complicity that exists in the shadows of official power. These women held no government positions, signed no orders, and appeared in no organizational charts. Yet they lived in stolen luxury, benefited from slave labor, and in some cases directly participated in cruelty. When the reckoning came, the law had no adequate framework to hold them accountable. Today, their story serves as a reminder that guilt isn't always a matter of official titles or legal authority. It's also about the choices we make when presented with evil, whether we resist, whether we profit, whether we look away. The Nazi wives chose luxury over morality, comfort over conscience. And when the war ended, most of them walked free, carrying their secrets and their stolen memories into quiet, unremarkable lives that their victims never got to live.